Welcome to this iteration of Davis Discoveries. I'm Lisa Fishman, I'm director of the Davis. This format wherein we take on and take a close look at one object in the collection has proven to be lively and rich and incredibly exciting, I think, for all of you who it brings here and all of the conversations that it involves and all of the conversations that it generates. And it has now become a thing. Davis Discoveries has now become a series. And we have, through the course of our research that Eve Strausman-Flanzer and Claire Whitner have undertaken, thinking about the reinstallation of the permanent collection for next fall, through the course of their research, they have found objects in the collection about which we really knew very little. And so Davis Discoveries really comes out of Davis Mysteries and expands on this notion of what you find when you look very closely at things in your own collection. So it is a source of great pride, I think, for all of us to be able to bring new attention, new scholarship, and new thinking to these objects and to share them with our community. So with that, let me introduce Claire Whitner, who's Associate Curator here at the museum and who will begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. This is such an exciting event for us because watching this painting transform has been about a 1.5-year process. So for those of you who are here, it means you are familiar with the promotional image that we're using for this symposium, which is a half-cleaned image of our painting. We thought it was provocative because you really do see this extraordinary contrast of the yellow to the white. But many of you who are here may think, what is a pen painting? And we will definitely cover that as we move along. But I think that is sort of also part of the provocation, that this is a very specific kind of painting at a very specific time. And ours has sort of revealed itself to be even greater than we could have ever hoped. So, as I said, it was a half-cleaned painting, that picture that you saw on the promotional information, except when it was discovered in storage, it was a fully dirty painting. I started here at the Davis in January 2014. Prior to coming here, I was at the MFA as the Curatorial Research Associate and Fellow for Old Master Paintings, and my concentration was primarily 17th century Dutch paintings. And so it was in that role that I first encountered pen paintings, this very sort of specialized subset of Dutch maritime painting. And so when I got here, I had Mark Beeman, who is now our head of exhibitions, manager of exhibitions, run a search for the Dutch paintings in our collection. And when I looked at the search and saw that we had a pen painting, I was like, well, that's intriguing. And it was even more intriguing that it was in storage. So Mark humored me and took me down to storage, showed me all the paintings. And the pen painting was really yellow. And now, I will say this, they're meant to look like prints. So this does not look like a print. This looks very yellow. And I was like, well, that's peculiar. And now, there is some dramatization here because we don't actually have a photograph of what exactly it looked like when it was looking down at heel, sitting in painting storage. But as Eve and I recall, there was a sort of sad frame that was on it. And even sadder, it was glazed and had a piece of blue tape across it. Now, I should stress, the blue tape was not actually on the surface, but it did not help the painting. And so I think it had just been overlooked for decades because it just, I mean, it's hard to love that. And yet, I said to Mark, I was like, well, these are actually really special. They're pretty rare, actually. Willem van de Velde the Elder only painted about 70 of these. Or at least that's what's known in the catalog raisonné. And I was like, but they're not supposed to be yellow. And he said, yeah, you know, when Sotheby's was here sort of doing, like, assessing the collection, like a couple months ago, they kind of freaked out when they saw this and they were very excited. And I said, yes, yet, again, the yellow. Now to talk a little bit, I've sort of briefly said, this is a subgenre within a genre. So really the story of the painting in the 17th century Netherlands is a story of sort of a great expansion of genres. It's also a period of expansion of genres that were secular. The 17th century in the Netherlands is sort of the golden age, the Gouden Eeuw, for you Dutch speakers out there. And it really started in 1581 with the birth of the Dutch Republic. And it's at a moment where you have a growing middle class that could afford to purchase paintings for their homes. You have the recession of a monarchical, a group of sort of kings and queens and princes that would be buying things for castles, so a very different scale of painting. These are paintings scaled more for your home than, say, for your manse. And the church ceases to be a commissioner of paintings at this moment, for the most part, because sort of Dutch Protestantism had, basically I equated sort of paintings and altars in cathedrals with idolatry. And so there was a wave of iconoclasms in the late 16th century, and you have this clearing out of Dutch churches. So instead, the rise of the secular genres. And there's a real sort of a blooming moment for the sort of standard historical genres, like portraiture. This is our Abraham de Vries double portrait. History painting remains still sort of upheld as sort of the greatest of the genres. This is Jan Steen's Sacrifice of Iphigenia. And in landscape, you have this sort of emergence of a unique Dutch landscape. This is a Haarlemse, a little painting of Haarlem by Jacob van Ruisdael. But beyond that, you have even more genres, an unthinkable number of genres. This is Peter StormareDom starts creating a whole subgenre of monochromatic church interiors. You have fish market scenes like the Emmanuel de Witte. There are scooterstuks or militia pieces like the famous Night Watch by Rembrandt. You have winter scenes by Avekamp. Tronies by Vermeer. These really abundant still lifes by Willem Kalf. Flower paintings by Rocco Royce. These sort of low-life images by Adriaan van Ostade, and a Gabriel Metsu really sort of high-life interior. And I could just go on. I mean, we could have made so many tiny little windows. There are so many genres. One other big genre that emerges is marine painting. And this is a marine paint, this is 1599, so incredibly early, by Heinrich Rome. It is an image of the return of this second visit to East India and of the Dutch fleet. So a real celebration of sort of what the Netherlands would become as a mercantile power. This is also a time when the Dutch fleet in general becomes very strong in terms of its navy. So it's not surprising that this becomes a very popular genre. But even within this genre, there are subgenres. There are people that specialize in stormy scenes, which is a Bachhause on the end. You have calms, which is Willem van der Velde the younger in the middle, and you have beach scenes. And this is not even meant to imply that there are only 3 subgenres within marine painting. It just goes on and on and on. So many paintings, so many different types of painting. Now, one of the innovators within the subgenres of marine painting is Willem van der Velde the Elder. He looks really humorless in this engraving, and yet I don't really think that was the case. He was kind of a wild man, and we will get to that. But he was born in 1611 in Leiden. He was from a very sort of nautically centered family. His father was a boat master. We don't really know what he was doing with his life until the late 1630s, because that's sort of the earliest known drawing by Willem van der Velde. But it seems like he was probably in the Navy, or he was somehow involved in sort of nautical life. He's probably sort of on boats from very early on in his life. But we know that in the 1630s, he moves to Amsterdam with his family, and drawings by Willem van der Velde the Elder start surfacing. Now, I say he looks very humorless, but he actually was sort of notorious for his love affairs. He fathered many children out of wedlock. This was a source of strife for his wife. And the Remmelt Daalder, who is the former head of the Scheepvaartsmuseum in Amsterdam, who is coming out with a book now about the Van der Veldes, and he said I should plug that book, so if anyone wants to hear more about that, look that up. He said he actually argues that the Van der Veldes, father and son, would have been even more famous and even held in even higher regard had they not been of such questionable moral. So I don't know how much, take that as you will, but he spent a lot of his time away from home. He spent a lot of time on boats, sort of traveling all over, all over Europe. Now, so as I said, 1630s, he starts coming up with drawings, and then engravings and etchings are made from his drawings. This is from 1639, And it's a portrait of a yacht, specifically the Amalia, which is the flagship of the Dutch Navy at that time. And of course, he was not a printmaker. This was engraved by Hugo Allard. So he is really, from the very beginning, a draftsman, and that's really what he remains. None of these engravings or prints that you see are by his hand. They are always adaptations from his drawing. But then in the 1640s, he becomes incredibly innovative. And he creates this whole new genre called the pen painting, or the penschilderij. And it's a tricky term because it seems sort of, like it's a contradiction, right? It's pen, but it's a painting. And that's because it really does kind of hold this liminal position between a work on paper and a painting. So much so that there's a quote in Romuald Dahlder's latest manuscript where he has found that Willem van der Velde the Elder actually described them as prints or drawings that you could wash with a sponge. So practicality. And I think really, as sort of silly as that is, it's incredibly practical because you cannot hang a print on your wall in perpetuity. It will degrade, the paper will degrade, the print will experience loss from constant light exposure. Whereas a panel painting is a bit more robust. They're not impervious, but you could hang that a lot longer. And so what they essentially are sort of paintings on either panel or canvas, and they are then executed, as Rhona will discuss in a bit, probably with a quill, maybe sometimes with a brush, potentially in iron gall ink, which would have been the standard sort of writing ink at the time, or with some other black pigment. A lot of this is yet to be determined, but they're incredibly unique. And prior to this moment, this does not exist. There are other people that start trying to take this up, but really no one does it better than Willem van der Velde the Elder. So, as I was saying, he did portraits of ships. And I just wanted to sort of draw your attention to this because people were collecting these kinds of ship portraits in and of themselves. They're really beautiful. And yeah, they were also being used as the material from which he could compose more intricate, more elaborate pen paintings. Because if you look here, he would also execute these incredibly sort of washy-looking drawings that were used really for developing further compositions. I don't want to fall on this, but you can see here just really the suggestion of the sails. It's very faint, but it's men hoisting a sail up onto the rigging. And then up here, it's just really designs, cannons, sort of the decorative elements on the boat. Now, why is this so washy? Well, because a lot of the time, what he was working on is he was actually on a boat trying to sketch these elements, which is, you have to work pretty quickly. You've spent a lot of time on boats in your life, but they're really not sort of the greatest platform for stability. It's a lot of moving around, especially when you look at sort of how the seas are being depicted in this image. So what you're looking at here is by the 1650s, his pen paintings were being held in incredibly high regard. And this particular scene is the Battle of Scheveningen Beach, or Ter Heide, which is the last battle of the Anglo-Dutch War in 1653. It's in this battle that Admiral Martin Tromp is killed. And the Tromp family then later comes back to Van der Velde and commissions a series of very large pen paintings that basically celebrate all of his famous battles. And we know that Van der Velde was actually at the Battle of Scheveningen. And this is to give you a sense of how big these actually are. They hang in the Rijksmuseum in the ship model gallery. But the reason why we know is that he actually was on his own galliot in the battle, that the States General at this point were sort of so impressed with his sort of ability to sort of function and create this kind of visual reportage that they had provided him with his own galliot, which is this sort of smaller sailing vessel. And he often kind of incorporates himself into the image, which is pretty exciting. That's his boat, slightly larger. Now, back to our painting. Oh, that's much better. So what do we know about our painting? So we encountered it. We didn't know a whole lot. We know that it was given to the museum in 1969 by Strafford Morse. It had been lent to the museum in 1961, and it was lent in honor of his late wife, Gabrielle Ladd Morse, who had sort of died shortly after graduating from Wellesley in 1958. She was killed in a tragic plane accident. And so to honor her memory, Mr. Morse gave these. He had been a member of the Navy, and I think is from a family of avid sailors, so it's unsurprising that he would have gravitated to this kind of painting. We don't know a lot before that. It surfaces in a sale in 1911 in Amsterdam, and I don't really know what happens. That is all of the provenance that we know about sort of the journey of this painting. I also know that sort of when we first saw it, this yellow, I started pestering Rhona, who will speak in a little bit, about sort of how are we going to clean this, how do we deal with this, because these can be very tricky to clean. I'd seen images of other pen paintings being cleaned where a lot of the lines had lifted when the varnish was removed, and that sounded really terrifying. So eventually she capitulated and just did it for us, which was really kind. But she'll have a lot more to say about the cleaning process. And so the other thing so when we got it, we had it listed in our catalog, it was listed as Willem van der Velde the Younger, who was born in 1633 and works with his father in the workshop, and that it was the embarkation of Charles II for England. So this is problematic for two reasons. The first reason being that Willem van der Velde the Younger never painted a pen painting ever in his life, as far as we know. There was no evidence of this, so that seemed unlikely. And then I looked and there was no evidence that there's anything to do with England in this painting at all. I mean, none of the flags would indicate that. None of the people in the little scenes would indicate that. And the thing is that, like, Willem van der Velde the Younger did actually paint the embarkation of Charles II, which is this oil painting from sort of the year of the Restoration, 1661. And roughly, we're assuming it was probably painted slightly after that. And it's quite prominent which of the pinks, the sort of little sailboats, was being used to sort of, help transport Charles II, because it has actually flags that would indicate sort of, English royalty. It's not a great image because the Wallace collection did not have a better image online, so I apologize for that, but hopefully someday you can go to the Wallace collection, ponder the painting, and appreciate the fact that there's a big difference between what's going on the boat here and what's going on the little boat in our painting, which is a fancy lady, her dog, and a man, so I don't think it's Charles II. That said, we were like, well, what is this then? What are comparative images? And we found actually two that look very similar to ours. The top is at the Louvre, and the one at the bottom is in Greenwich at the Maritime Museum there. And these paintings are from the early 1650s. And that really does seem in keeping, it's very hard. I tried to put up images of later Willem van der Velde the Elder pen paintings from the 60s to show you the difference between the sky, but it does not translate in the slides. It all just kind of looks white, so it was not the most compelling of visual material. So you'll just have to take my word for it, that the sky in these paintings looks very similar. It's washy, there's a lot of atmosphere, and that kind of goes away in the subsequent decade. Also, I think they're sort of remarkably similar. You have this sort of large States yacht-like boat here on the left, and then the beach as it rises to the right with these different groups of more genre-like figures. There's sort of fisher folk and wealthier people that are there to buy fish from the fisher folk. And it's pretty exciting because at Greenwich, there are actually sort of sketches that he did of fisher folk on the beach that is roughly from this period. So it seems like a pretty good bet that this is 1650s. And Remmel Daalder, our friend in the Netherlands, has also pointed out that he thinks that maybe these more genre-like images emerged as Willem van der Velde is at Scheveningen Beach, sort of waiting for the battles that are about to start in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And so that's when he starts studying the people there and creating these kinds of images. And that seems pretty legitimate. Now, in the catalog Raisonné, which our painting is in, but it's a very tricky catalog to use. So we were able to find our painting once we knew more about it, which was once it was in the 1650s. We were like, oh, and there we are. It's listed under Jewett Art Center. How fantastic. Is that we really get a sense that this is it's an early style of pen painting for Willem van der Velde, sort of really in the first decade in which he's making these kinds of paintings. Now, as I was saying, we have these studies that are at Greenwich. You're probably wondering, why are all of these studies and paintings in Greenwich in England when these men are in fact Dutch? And that is because Willem van der Velde the Elder and his son moved to England in roughly 1672, 1673. They're invited by Charles II, and they move into the Queen's house they move to Greenwich, and they hold a studio in the Queen's house. And so if you find yourself in London, it is a lovely trip. And you just hop on the boat, you can go to Greenwich, and you can actually visit this room, which is where they believe served as his studio while he was in Greenwich, which is pretty exciting. And this is, I apologize that it's from so far away. I took this picture last March when I went to go look at all of these pen paintings together, and I was more mesmerized by the fact that there was grass and flowers than by anything else, because as you recall what it was like here, it did not look like that. So I was still kind of like blown away by how nice the weather could be in England. Now, as I was just saying earlier, I just wanted to make the point that there is no way that this could be painted by anyone else other than Willem van der Velde the Elder, because these are the people that sort of took on that style and tried to sort of come up with their own pen paintings, and just the quality pales. I mean, it's like he's just clearly, this is his style, and he has had mastery of it. But people like, I think it's Adriaan van Zalm, Experience, what is his last, at any rate, Cornelis Bouwmeester and Cornelis Mooi, that these are people that are really lesser known names in Dutch painting, and it just doesn't have the same impact. Now, speaking of the impact, I think the thing that is most impressive about these paintings is this detail. It's extraordinary. And so I want to kind of revisit that notion of a drawing that you can sponge down, because it seems that this idea of like a drawing, is kind of a misspeak, because these don't look like drawings, they look like engravings. And they're really much more in the language of the engraving than they are of drawing. And you can see that in just the difference from the way that he describes the detail of a boat versus the way that he describes the detail. So when he's drawing, it's just very, very different. You get the curved line, you get a whole variety of different types of lines. And so I would say, in fact, it is really much more the language and sort of the longer tradition of Northern printmaking. This is sort of a great example. And I think you get a real sense of sort of how the kinds of lines that you hear in the Hendrik Goltzius, this is the famous Goltzius Farnese Hercules. He goes to Rome, he makes an image of it, and it's possibly a portrait of himself and his stepson, but that has not been confirmed, but just so you know. And I thought it would be a nice way to sort of juxtapose the two men, because you have sort of Dutch men, right, being represented in, you get this hat in both instances. And even though there are differences in style that, this is an engraving, this is something that's being done by hand with a pen, the kind of marks that he's making with his pen really are the kind of marks that are following this style of sort of cross-hatching, to create darkness, longer lines to create sort of a fluidity of motion, points to encourage this sense of a curving line. And I think what's really fascinating about that is that Willem van der Velde the Elder is not a printmaker. So it's curious that this is not something that he trained in, as far as we know. And so he's not an engraver, he hasn't gone through that kind of an apprenticeship, and yet sort of he's very drawn to that sort of style. And it becomes this new way of sort of using that language of the print, but in entirely, from the perspective of a draftsman. And I say, in conclusion, we could not be happier with how our pen painting has turned out. I think it has traveled a long way from when it was first discovered last January to where it is now in its lovely reproduction Dutch ripple frame. And I think with that, I would like to introduce the next speaker, which is Rhona MacBeth. She is the Rosemary and Eijk van Otterloo Conservator of Paintings and Head of Paintings Conservation at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. And then following Rhona, I'll step in again and introduce Daniel Finamore, who is the Russell W. Knight Curator of Maritime Art and History at the Peabody Essex Museum. And he is a true scholar of maritime art, unlike myself, who is a mere imposter and just sort of lover of pen paintings. So hopefully he'll be able to fill you in on any details that you might need. But so please, Rhona, I will work on pulling up your presentation. This one? Oh, thank you. This one? I think there was something about a pointer.
That's okay.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Please tell me if I talk too quietly. I've got a little bit of a cold, so if I start to drift off, just raise your hand and tell me to speak more loudly. I'm delighted to be here. It's been a great pleasure to work on this project with Claire. And yes, I think we've come a long way since that winter morning or afternoon in the basement, sort of squinting at this very dark painting, wondering what it was. And I have to say, it really has been an extraordinary journey for me as well. I'm not an expert on ship paintings, that's for sure. And if I get any of the terminology wrong, I'm trying to avoid all ship terminology altogether. But if I do, I'm sure I'll be corrected very rapidly by someone in the front row. I really just want to talk a little bit about the process of conserving this painting, a little bit about the technical examination that we undertook and actually are still working on getting the results, but we are by no means finished with this project. But what I do remember very strongly is being in the storeroom looking at this picture, which actually the glazing and the blue tape were gone, I think, and wondering what it was, and talking to Claire about it, and obviously the attribution didn't make sense. But even in that dark room, it seemed to be a picture of quality. And something that was worth further investigation. So, as she said, after a few months of back and forth, it came to the MFA to be studied a little more carefully. And I just wanted to show you a couple of details. I hope they read well enough of once we got it under a microscope and could really look at it in great detail, how extraordinary the penmanship or brushwork or both, because I'm not convinced it's either or is. There's just a couple of details from some of the groups, or one of my favorite details. I just have to say, if you're a dog person, gotta love this dog. You can also see, I think, pretty clearly that the varnish is very, very thick, and in fact that cracking that you see is not in the paint film, it's the thick varnish that's on top. I have no idea how long it's been since this picture was cleaned, but perhaps we should be grateful for benign neglect, because it also is, and you can see this even looking through the darkened varnish, it's in spectacular condition. And after a year of traveling and looking at pen paintings both in Greenwich and most recently at the Rijksmuseum, I'm not sure I've seen another picture in this condition. It's really remarkable. I just want to show you a picture of, this is actually a bamboo reed pen, the pens that we presume an artist like Van de Velde would have been using would be a thinner reed pen that you can actually make a very, very fine tip with. Those reeds still grow on the banks of canals in Holland. You can still make them. And there have been various experimentation done by conservators in Holland about trying to figure out exactly how he made his paintings, and we understand some of it is still a bit unclear. And then it is signed, not dated sadly, though I think I'm also convinced by Claire's dating, and I'm going to show some more pictures just at the very end that I also think it's very convincingly that the painting is somewhere in the 50s, the early 50s, but a very clear signature, and also I hope you can see that there's a sort of scraping of the signature that suggests that application by a pen, perhaps one of those very fine reed pens, as opposed to a brush. I think, like, if you look in the E of the Velde and Van de Velde, you can really see that it really looks like it's applied with a pen. Now, what the media is, what the paint/ink is another question. I promise there'll be very few charts, but I did want to point this out just so we know where we are, because I'm going to do a little bit about technical examination and how we figure some things out. I just want to point out that what we see is really a our eyes are sensitive in this tiny little region, whereas all this other energy and ability to image things is within our grasp. And in this day, we're going to really talk about X-rays and ultraviolet. Infrared, not so helpful with this painting and other pictures, but I just wanted to show you that's where we are within the spectrum when we look. And I'm going to start with ultraviolet. It's always one of the first things we do. Many people here will know it as blacklight, a high energy light source that is reflected back. What this really tells us is it's a very old natural resin, that green cast, and it's a kind of very dark green because it was so dirty. There was a lot of soot on it as well and just dirt, as well as the thick yellowed varnish. And I think you can see up in the right-hand corner, there's also a little cleaning test, which I'll come back to. But one of the first things is just to look. Not very much in the way of obvious restoration on this picture. That's also partly because it's being so masked by the varnish and the dirt. You can see a little bit at the bottom center. I think you can see a kind of darker more purple patches. That's some more recent restoration that was on the surface. But overall, it looked remarkably good. I'm also going to talk about X-radiography, often a very useful technique in studying paintings. If you don't know how we X-ray works of art, very simple, very similar to what you get at the dentist or the doctor, where there's a source for the X-rays, the artwork's placed in front of that source, and some kind of plate that's sensitive to the rays penetrating the painting, and will create an image behind. So it's a very simple technique and an incredibly useful technique, and the most important thing to always remember when looking at X-rays is it shows you every layer. It's not just showing you one particular area of the painting, so you have to be able to interpret it. A little bit disappointing with your picture. This gives you, we got a really beautiful image of the wood, and it's a panel that's in two pieces. I think you can see about 3/4 of the way up there's a horizontal join and a little bit of damage. The white is actually an old fill that shows up because it has X-ray opaque containing lead white in it. But other than that, it really didn't tell us too much. I am intrigued around the edges. I hope you can see there are little holes all around the edges of the panel, and we still haven't been able to figure out exactly what those are. I've asked a lot of people, a lot of experts on Dutch painting, and no one has been able to explain those to me. A frame, some sort of framing device, we're sure. Maybe it was inserted into some sort of framing in a wall, we don't know, but they have been there a very, very long time, that much we know. And then the last thing that the X-ray shows you is there's a little tiny piece missing at the bottom left-hand corner, but not a big deal. I thought I'd show you what X-rays sometimes show you on another painting, just to give you an idea of what we thought we might see something. This is a picture you probably are all familiar with, Rembrandt's fabulous artist in his studio. And just to show you the X-ray of that very quickly without getting off on too much of a tangent. It's not that easy an X-ray to read, but you can, I think, you can see it's on a wooden panel. You can see that there are nails around the edges because it has little wooden strips around the edges, so you're seeing the nails very clearly. I think you can see the easel that the artist is working on. And if you look really hard, the artist is there as well. I'm going to point him out for you, at least the palette, and you can see him. Palette, I think, is here, and actually the figure of the artist is right here. This is a painting that was probably reused, a panel that was probably reused, so that brushwork is about painting something out below the surface. So as again, you're seeing the wooden support, you're seeing the priming layers, you're seeing under layers of paint, and then also what's on the surface. But back to Van de Velde. So we decided that we would do a couple little cleaning tests. This one is in the upper left of the sky, right at the top left up there. It's not in this image, but that's where I decided I would take my first test. And tentatively, the varnish seemed to remove remarkably easily. They are a little frightening because I've seen many over-cleaned pen paintings and wanted to go cautiously, but the varnish dissolved relatively easily. The difference was huge. What you see under the varnish is a little bit of restoration, particularly at the edges. Most of the restoration on this picture is actually overpaint around the edges, disguising damage. And again, we did another one, now moving more into where it's actually drawn. And again, you see there's overpaint at the edges, but it seemed like it was possible to gently dissolve and remove the overlying natural resin yellowed varnish layers and leave the drawing below the surface untouched. We thought we would also do just a little bit more analysis. So I wanted to show you, we took a sample from the upper left-hand corner again. And I just also I hope you can see the little speck of dust in the block of resin. That's the size of a cross-section. We don't take it with scalpels that large, but that gives you a sense. That's not a very big scalpel, so it gives you an idea how tiny the sample is. We actually use ophthalmic scalpels to take samples, which are used in eye surgery, so that gives you an idea how little they are. And this is what we get as a result of taking that sample. What we do is, you see the sample embedded in the block of resin, then we grind down the resin up to the sample, so you get basically, if you imagine a core sample, from the surface of the painting down through each layer. And actually, Louise Orsini, who took this sample, got quite a bit of wood in it as well. The bottom part of the sample, where you can see all the cell structure, and it's sort of brown, that's just the wooden panel. That's the wooden support. But right above that, and I hope you can make it out, I don't have a pointer, or I'd point it out to you, is the first ground layer. And it's exactly what we were looking for. It's a warm tan color that seems to be on many Van de Velde's. He seems to have quite a consistent way of preparing his pen paintings. And the underlying layer tends to be a warm color that's got some lead white in it, some possibly earth colors, and also some calcium carbonate. And it's in oil, not in glue. And then on top of that, the very white layer is lead white. And we think he applied the lead white layer himself, or at least that's what's been suggested. We think we're seeing another layer on top of that that's actually a very thin layer that probably sealed the white priming layer. And then on top of that, because this was taken from an area of the painting that's clouds, that's actually a paint layer. That translucent layer on the very top is a paint layer that has both lead white, calcium carbonate, and a lot of oil in it, so which makes perfect sense because the clouds do seem to be painted. They're not drawn, those are painted. So structurally, it certainly fits very well with everything else that has been published, which isn't so much actually, but what has been published seems to be very consistent. And I just wanted to thank Louise Orsini, who's one of our wonderful paintings conservators and who does most of the cross-section analysis for us, and Michelle Derrick, who is one of our research scientists. We couldn't do this work without them, and they are want to continue to actually give us more clear results, because we're still trying to figure out what the drawing medium is. We're leaning towards thinking it may actually be lamp black rather than an iron gall ink. But I'm starting to think, the more I look at the painting and also at other works by Van de Velde, that actually we may have more than one painting medium in the painting as well. But we need to do more research before we know that for sure. Just want to quickly take you through now the cleaning process and just give you some details of what it was like to clean the picture and watch the amazing draftsmanship below be revealed. And then just to back and forth to give you an idea, this is obviously just starting the cleaning at the left-hand side, and this is it under UV, so it gives you an idea of how UV light or black light can just help you see what you're doing. Though honestly, the painting was so yellowed, it was pretty clear what was happening, just in normal light conditions. And this is a specular light image that gives you an idea of how, I hope you can get a sense of how thick the varnish was. I think at least a couple of very thickly applied layers. And here we're moving ahead, just going from left to right, because I'm right-handed, across the painting, removing all the varnish. The only areas that really, with much restoration on them at all, are again around the edges. You can see they've kind of got a yellowy, pinky color. That's really the majority of the overpaint. That's where we found it, which is not a very important area for it to be in at all. That's unfortunately what it looked like. Most of it happily came off, some of it didn't, and I just toned it out. But the very thickly applied, nasty overpaint around the edges, not uncommon. But the rest of the painting, spectacular. You can just see the quality of the rigging. I'm not going to try and describe what the rigging is doing, but it's all there as far as I can tell, and really in beautiful, beautiful shape. And so then the lower left is now cleaned, and you can see the signature very clearly. Take note of the little jar floating in the water, because he seems to like to float things in water. They're often either little fish or there are little things floating about in the oceans, which presumably there were, given how busy they were. And then just progressing across the painting, very straightforwardly, halfway. I love this detail for a couple of reasons. Partly, this is right in the center of the painting, and I hope you can see the tiny little ships going off into the distance, almost right in the center of the composition, and completely intact. Those are the sorts of things that can disappear so easily. The other thing that I'd like you to notice on this is that the surface of the painting has actually, and when you get a chance to come up close to look at it later, it has actually something of a topography. There is a real sense of that ground layer giving texture to the surface. And I think that's a very conscious decision on Van de Velde's part. And I actually find it quite beautiful. But it's got a three-dimensionality to it. It's not completely flat. And then almost cleaned. And again, the quality of the groups of figures that are being revealed, and the condition absolutely superb. This is after cleaning before any restoration was put on. You can see just a little mend to the bottom left-hand corner, a little bit of filling along the cracks, and then mostly around the edges. There's the mend, and then again you can see those holes, which we haven't figured out. I filled damages but left the holes intact because I think they're part of the history of the painting, and I'd really like to figure out what they were for. I also, at the MFA we're in the midst of class distinctions. I also love the dress codes that come through in this picture. There you have everybody from every walk of life, from those with the very fancy boots to those who sit on the ground, and everything in between, and then there's the painting complete, but much better to look at the actual real thing to my left. This is a terrible image of a painting that Claire already showed you. I'm basically following along the same lines. This is the picture I find the closest by far. It's larger, quite a bit larger than our painting, but a lot of the details, if you go back again, that little jar floating in the water, the pier, even the sort of baskets and debris at the lower right-hand corner seem very, very similar to what you find in our painting. It would be very interesting to get a really good image of that picture at some point. And again, some of the details of what's going on in the picture. There's so much life in this painting. There's so many different things happening, and it's the brushwork or the pen work is just beautifully rendered. Not necessarily like a drawing, but not quite like a print either. It's like something in between for me. Definitely following, I think, the idea of a print and suggesting a print, but then there's also a kind of a fluidity that I think is quite remarkable. And I think he had a sense of humor. These are just a couple of little details from the kind of center right of the picture. The fisherman dragging his his fish out of the water. And then in the little group to the right, I hope you can make it out, there's a child having his bottom wiped. I'm sure it happened every day on the seashore. And very Dutch. It seems to be in all Dutch paintings. And then the details of one of the other group figures. I find the man standing holding the rope really beautiful and beautifully rendered. And both the pen work, but also the scratching in to remove some of the black pen or paint as well, so that it actually goes back and forth. And then there's that dog again. And then a close-up, just to give you again an idea of the fluidity of the actual marks being made. And I also, this is one of the things I need to pursue and talk to Claire more about, but I really feel there's a couple of different implements being employed to make this image. Some of it looks like pen to me, some of it looks like brush, and possibly two different media as well, because some looks grey and some has a much warmer cast. Now, this is all conjecture. We have more looking to do, but really very, very interesting. And I also just the expression on the face, and this could be taken as rather another famous Dutch artist working about 200 years later. I mean, the quality of the line is superb, and as some of you may know, Van Gogh also drew many times with reed pens. Just a couple of the other groups to look at quickly, and the interactions, and the same, these drawings, really interesting. He seemed to like to draw people holding, their hands behind their backs. They turn up all over in his paintings. But I'm intrigued also, this is a pen and brown ink with a grey wash, and I'm kind of intrigued because I feel like I'm seeing brown and grey in the pen paintings as well. So it makes sense to me that they might be a little bit of a combination of both things. And just to go back, the interactions very, very different, but also something that's quite similar. I also think he had a sense of humor. I love the mop in the boat. This is right in the center. You can find it in one of the yachts, and the little mop sticking out. So high life and low life together. And this is another drawing where he has. I only include it because he has the boots drying on the sticks. You see these everyday elements in his work a great deal, I think. And then there's a sort of pathos as well. This is a tiny, tiny detail in the background of the painting. A single figure looking out to the ocean. There's a sort of wonderful gentleness and observation in these paintings as well. Same image that Claire showed you, just up even closer, so you can see him sitting in his boat. And I was sort of intrigued because this is given to the date 55, and to me, the way this is rendered seems very close to the Davis picture again. These are all produced in around the same time. And if you go and you look at the way the hats are drawn, the faces in shadow are drawn, it seems very, very similar. And that's just my last slide to bring you back to the man himself. He unfortunately didn't date it, but I think maybe Claire has for us, and thank you.
Thank you, Rhona. You have done a wonderful thing for us and sort of brought this painting back to its former glories. We're incredibly, incredibly happy. And I'd like to introduce our last speaker, who's Daniel Finamore, and I can never remember his endowed title, so I've written it down. I apologize. Russell W. Knight, Curator of Maritime Art and History at the Peabody Essex Museum. And there you go.
Thank you, Claire. Well, this is fun because so much has been covered up to now. We've pointed out a lot of very interesting attributes of this painting and touched upon subjects that I'd like to worm my way down into a little bit more deeply in a few instances. But I think it's fair to say when I first started looking at this painting, I could tell that it was fabulous, that there was wonderful subject matter in it, not to mention the technique, but it took me a very long time to really absorb just how much there is in the painting. And there's no way that in a single viewing you can really absorb all of the activity that's taking place in this, but I'm certainly going to give it a try and get you started. I'm sorry, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Let me start out this way with what I have up on the screen here is a painting by Heinrich Rome. This is the second painting by Heinrich Rome. We've seen, Claire showed a painting that reflected the second return of the Dutch fleet from the East Indies expedition. This is something like that. It's an 8-foot long painting, which is currently on display at the Peabody Essex Museum, which gives you a sense of what happened in marine painting. Before the 1590s, there was no such genre as secular marine painting. By the 1620s, when this was probably created, it was already an extremely specialized genre with very specific types of information worked into it, encoded bits of information, references to subjects and objects and people that everyone was sort of expected to understand. This painting shows 2 ships and a small boat in the foreground filled with carving, activities, weaponry, sails at very particular positions. It's a moment in time, not to mention the flags. All of this was supposed to impart a very specific set of information that would then tell you the story of what was going on there. My point being that in this particular case, we've not been able to translate the vast majority of this. This is just something we're starting down the road with. There are 2 competing theories about the painting, and they're based largely in the Dutch facing down the Portuguese/Spanish to the right, and in the foreground is a man standing in the boat nobly blasting away in a very symbolic fashion. Who that person is, whether this is in the East Indies or the West Indies, whether this is a symbolic act or whether this is a very specific act, all of this is being worked out at the moment. A lot of the argument, it revolves around the significance of each of these flags, and it never gets more complicated than the flags in Dutch paintings of the 17th century. So if you want to be kind to me when you're looking at a Dutch painting, don't ever point out and say, what's the significance of that flag? Because I'll have to admit, most of the time, I really can't tell you. They were so specific in every single situation. In any event, that's almost the point at which we started with this kind of a painting when it first arrived. What is it? It was clearly not carefully studied when it entered the museum here. Robinson, when he put the painting into his catalog raisonné, he used other known paintings to sort of catalog it. Oh, it's like the ones that he knew better at the Louvre and elsewhere, and he got it pretty much spot on and applied a pretty appropriate title to it. So what I wanted to do is sort of walk around the painting a little bit and show you some of the attributes that are informative, that caught my eye, that clearly caught Robinson's eye, and just point out how they are informative of the early 17th century maritime life, and what is it that one would look at in other paintings like this. The most obvious place to start is the very large vessel coming into anchor off the on the left-hand side of the picture. What kind of vessel is it? What is going on in the painting? So what we see is the vessel coming into anchor. How do we know it's coming into anchor and not hoisting anchor and departing? That's because of the particular configuration of the sails at the moment. They're loosening the feet of the sails on the foremast. You can see that they're sort of flapping in the wind. There's nobody manning them at the time. They've been loosened, slackened, so that the air will spill out of them and the ship will slow down. Farther behind them, I think I have that slide there, you can see men on the upper yards of the main, and they are literally taking it in. You can see they're hauling that sail up. They've already cleared what's called the main course there, which cleared the deck, so that sailors could then operate on the deck and do what they needed to do to slow the ship down and then bring it into anchor. So we can actually see these kinds of activities, and you can read a sequence into that. You don't see the sequence in this particular ship. It's just a one moment in time, but it was intended to be very clear exactly what was going on. And just for Rhona's benefit, to show the different kinds of rigging here, without belaboring it too much, we have the very straight lines are the standing rigging. For the most part, those are the rigid lines that hold up the yards, that hold up the masts of the ship. So they're ratcheted down very tightly, and they're always very straight. And I would say, in general, it's much easier for an artist to paint these than it is the running rigging, that rigging which was intended to move around the ship. And that's all of the slack lines that you see here, which I think is very distinctive of certain artists. I can actually use this kind of presentation to attribute certain paintings to certain artists because they would use different kinds of media to draw that slackened line. If you think about a rope hanging down at a certain angle, there's that dipping point where it comes back, and the weight and the balance of it is very important, whether it was done freehand or whether it was done with flexible curves. On the long lines, whether an artist had to stop halfway along and then pick it up again. You can sometimes see the way it matches up. So this can be very informative and I think very entertaining to look at as well, and it gives you a little insight into the process of creating a painting like this. So back to the ship itself, we see that it's coming into anchor because in the upper right here, the anchor is still catted. That's a great term. And the anchor is attached to the cat head, which is right on the bulwarks at the front of the ship, and the flukes are being swung down. You don't just let it go. You bring it down slowly so that it gets righted and then drops into the water. In the lower right, in a pre-cleaning image, it's probably too difficult for you to see, but later on you can come up and take a look. The head of the rudder is still on this hook. So it's fished, they call it. So if it's fished, it's not about to fall. You have to hoist it off, and you do that with ropes and a capstan, and then you drop it in. And that's the process that's underway here. And then behind it, up at the top, is another, and we can see there, is another anchor. That would be the sea anchor, and that's stowed, because they don't use the sea anchor when they're coming into shore. So all of this is very specific information, and the detail is very intentional in every single element of this. We're seeing a heavily armed ship. The fact that all of these gun ports are open and the guns are drawn out is unusual, because this is not enemy territory. This is a lot of work to bring all of these guns out like this, but I think Van de Velde was doing this. Either they were as a naval exercise and they were running the guns, or this was his way of showing how heavily armed this ship is. So immediately you say, well, it's a naval ship, and it's quite likely a naval vessel, but an East India merchant vessel would also be heavily armed like this. A typical merchant vessel that was not running out of the North Sea or the Atlantic may not have been this heavily armed, because they would run in fleets under the protection of the Dutch Navy with other naval vessels surrounding them. So this is probably either an East India vessel or a warship under commission. So when we look at the flags on the in the left-hand side there, we see large square flags. A little farther on, I'll show you some other images where you don't. In the foreground image, you can see there's one little triangular flag. It's a pennant. These flags mean different things. Now, in the large ship, all the square flags are indicating that these are the flags of a nation or of a province or of a very specific location. Whereas if they were flying pennants and these flags, they would be indicating squadron association, a fleet affiliation, or private ownership in some fashion. So the boat in the foreground is privately owned. That was probably somebody's private signal. And then the flag on the large ship is actually a large vessel. It's probably, I would think it's quite likely to be an East Indiaman, which would not fly a squadron flag, and a naval vessel may or may not have in a situation like this. So it's very interesting that way. And also Robinson, I think, correctly cataloged the painting as the ship being from Rotterdam because of the construction of the ship at the tops. It's very hard to see again here, but right up here, the tops between the mainmasts and the topmasts, where people would stand, where lots of rigging would come up to be attached. It's just an anachronism, a quirkiness of the construction of ships in Rotterdam in the south of the Netherlands, where they would build the tops round. Whereas if you visit the Constitution, they're half round in the front part and square on the back. If you look at many ships of the 19th century, they're square or rectangular. In Rotterdam, they built them round. Luckily for us, so we can have a little insight into this ship. In the background, again, I think Rhona showed this slide with that kind of depth perspective. It's wonderful. It really draws the eye back, and the subtlety with which it fades out. Just when you think it's faded out, you look a little harder, and there's another boat, and there's another boat. It's unbelievable, including this one right here, which might be the smallest boat on the whole canvas, and the whole panel. I think Rhona would know better. It's just a little sailing vessel. It's of the smallest sort, with a very funny rig, actually. It's a loose-footed kind of a mast, and it's just whipping in and out of the fleet. So this is a very small kind of a vessel. To the left, we can see a much larger vessel that is part of the same fleet as the ship we were just looking at, and this time you're seeing the stern end, so you're seeing all the decoration on that thing from a slightly farther distance. Van de Velde did some wonderful drawings and sketches, very accurate, highly detailed, of these sterns of these highly decorated Dutch vessels, whether they were naval vessels, East Indiamen, or admiralty yachts of various sorts. The term yacht is coined by the Dutch, and they decorated these yachts dramatically. I think I'll talk about yachts in a second in the next few slides. But in this case, he doesn't really emphasize the ship carving that much, but he references it in very interesting ways throughout. And in this case, he has shown how heavily decorated the ship is without really belaboring it and going into the specifics of the detail of that particular vessel. Here in the foreground, in front of this ship, is Boyer yachts, and these are boats. Yachts were, the word yacht in Dutch originally meant fleet or swift, like a deer running through the woods, and these yachts weren't necessarily originally built as pleasure boats, but to run messages between ships of a fleet or from ship to shore during naval engagements and that sort of thing. And eventually they were small, purpose-built, fast boats. And eventually people started to sail more for pleasure and decorate their boats, and there became official state yachts, and wealthy merchants would have their own yachts, and most of the investment in the decorations was at the stern of these things. These particular yachts are particularly small, are very small. Boyers have a very distinctive kind of rig, and you see that tiny little gaff at the top up here. It's a very long sail, a very large sail, and it's different on others. This is two boats with exactly the same rig. They are actually identical in many, many ways. That sort of apple stern that you see on the one all the way to the left, that very heavily rounded stern, very unusual, very distinctive of Boyers. And then there's also this heavily rounded bow. These aren't designed to be particularly fast boats, but these were stable, shallow boats, beamy, wide, so that they didn't heel too much, so they were very pleasant for a day's outing. In actual fact, it's quite possible that what we're looking at is the same boat twice, once from the bow and once from the stern. Now, I'm speculating, and I'll speculate several more times this afternoon, but this is a presentation that is very common in the marine art tradition, to show a single vessel in more than one position, although I can't say I know of any other examples this early in time. So it's known to be an 18th century technique. There might be 17th century examples. I think there's one that was turned up in the National Gallery that was Arthur Wheelock put together two halves of a panel, and I think it might actually turn out to be the same ship twice. But there aren't very many examples of the 17th century, so we're out there. And so if that is the case, then this yacht or these yachts are actually the primary subject matter, I would argue, of the painting. And if they are the primary subject matter of the painting, then it could easily be that the painting was created for the owner of that boat, which would have been a very common situation in the creation of marine art. So, again, something to think about and maybe pursue further. Let's look a little more closely at the hull on the left, and it's a good opportunity just to point out one of the most distinctive elements of Dutch boat design is this large board. One would appear on the side of each side of the vessel. They're called lee boards, and in the very shallow waters around this part of the Netherlands, you couldn't really use boats with deep keels because you couldn't get in close to shore. So in order to keep a flat bottom, instead of a sharp bottom that would get stuck in the sand, you would have two sort of false keels. And when the boat was heeling this way, you would drop the downwind lee board and it would act as a keel. And then if you tacked and you were on the other point of sail, you would raise that one and drop this. So it would allow you to get through much more shallow waters. And it's a distinctive Dutch design. You still see it on Dutch boats today. Fabulous. As I'm talking about this, references to some of the carving, you can see that there's a wonderful lion figurehead there, but that's not the subject of the painting. It's partially obscured by the sail and some of the rigging. And over there on the left at the top of the rudder is what's called a rudder head, and there is a face with a hat, and it's facing the other direction. So you see just enough to know that it's a highly decorated stern on that vessel. And this is just my point to say that these boats, the Boyer was a yacht, but it was developed from a workboat. And so this is a moment in time when there weren't a lot of very highly designed, fancy, purpose-built yachts, but people were taking workboats and adapting them and turning them into what we know of today as yachts. And that same thing happened in early America. This is the first deepwater American luxury sailing yacht. Cleopatra's Barge, launched in 1816. Its bicentennial is next year. And it is basically the lines of a merchant vessel, which were then taken and decorated to no end to become a boat strictly used for pleasure. And this is this is an English version, early 19th century, of a single ship in three positions. So you have a portrait of a ship, you have all of the lines and all of the sails and the activity, you have a good broadside view of the hull, and then also this is what the ship looks like when she's coming in with all of her sails set, including the stunsails that were slid out the sides, and then this is what the ship looks like all the way to the left as she's coming into the harbor, and here's a stern view. So in one painting, you get three views of the ship. So let's return to some of the good stuff here. This rudder head, we know about figureheads. Everyone here, I'm sure, has seen figureheads or knows enough about 19th century American clipper ships to know that figureheads were the prominent decorative elements on them. But in the Netherlands, the most prominent decorative elements tended to be rudder heads. These things protruded up from the stern of the vessel over the taffrail, the back end of the ship. And that's where the primary piece of carving went. And unlike later English and American carvings, these faced inwards. These were primarily intended for the decoration of the entertainment of the passengers on board. So here we see a male head wearing a hat or a helmet looking inwards. Men were not all that common. It was more frequently women, and more frequently than that was religious scenes. So to see this male figure here, to me indicates more likely than not that this is a specific vessel that actually existed beyond the realm of the painting and may or may not be identifiable today. This is actually a very large rudder head carving of a male head, very similar with the same kind of mustache, that was brought up from the English Channel just a few years ago. It's still attached to 28 feet of rudder. So it's an enormous wood conservation project, but all sorts of other carvings of this ship that went down, probably of the same time period, early to mid 17th century. So it's a spectacular find. This is much more common. What we see here, this is a later Dutch rudder head. I just wanted to show it because it has original or old paint on it. So the color scheme gives you a good sense of how playful this would have been and how you would really be entertained by all of these carvings when you were in the cockpit looking around. Looking at some of these figure groupings, I just can't help imagining the range of society typical of the Dutch. The artists would commingle all sorts of classes together on the beach, and of course that's what the current MFA exhibition is really all about. But what we're looking at here is all sorts of little groupings that appear very clearly in other paintings as well. So Van de Velde wasn't inventing these groupings, he was really borrowing ideas and presenting sort of emblems of things we know the Dutch liked to include in their paintings. And Claire touched upon this group. This is a fishing probably a fishing party, and it's probably actually a fish market. This De Vlieger painting, which Claire showed a smaller version of here, is a great example of that, but there are several others like this. And you can see the boats, we know this is this same part of the Netherlands because the boats were literally brought up onto the beach at high tide. When the tide went out, the boats were on the sand, dry sand, and then they would bring the fish off of the boat onto the sand, and the market would be held right there. So they would auction off the fish or sell the fish right there. In the foreground, you see this strange looking thing here. We'll see one of those again. So this kind of imagery is very standard, very recognized by the Dutch. And this is, oh yes, on this coast, they sell fish this way. And here we have a very similar tube, and with a very prominent cross-hatching. I'm not sure what this is. If I had to guess, I'd say it's a bait trap. There's a handle at one end, and they're very similar kind of wicker devices that you would drag through the water where they're anchovy schooling or something like that, and the water would run through and the fish would get trapped in it, and then you would use that as bait to fish. Sort of a prosaic little reference to just a workaday tool of the fishermen, whereas just next to them are these very well-dressed figures who are also coming down, all of whom are there to see the fleet as it's anchoring and is preparing for its departure. And so it's a cross-section of social classes who are there to do that. Why did I show this one? Oh, I can't, I back off a little bit here in order to get the jetty in the background and that signal at the pole at the top, because that again appears in many Dutch paintings, and we just saw a Ruysdael painting. Here's another Jacob van Ruysdael painting, exactly the same subject. So these are things, they are very prominent on the Dutch landscape around the coastlines, very horizontal kind of topography, so anything that sticks up vertically is seen and noticed, and you see these kinds of jetties with these prominent signals at the ends of them quite regularly. But at the same time, I want to point out that in the background we see land. There's a steeple all the way back there. And so this waterway with the deep water ships in it with a land farther off is really one location, which is most likely to be Den Helder, looking out at Texel Island, which was a very common place for fishing boats to offload, and also as a meeting point for all sorts of vessels that were engaged in deep water activity before they were heading out to sea. They would, this would be, it's a peninsula where you would, they would all convoy before they headed out. So that location by Robinson, I think, is quite likely to be the case. And we also do know, interestingly enough, that Van de Velde was there, and he actually went out with Witte de With to observe the fleet in August of 1653, which falls right in nicely with the dates. And so he could have been there preparing to depart with this squadron in order to draw the famous battle that was to ensue following. And these could have been based on his preparatory sketches, some of which we just saw that look suspiciously familiar to these here. If we look a little farther in, here is the fancy party. All they're doing, there's a wagon in the foreground with horses. The wagon is really there just to get the people into the boat, because there's no piers here. It's very difficult to get in and out of the boats. If you climb into the boat when it's on the beach, you have to sit around and wait for the tide to come in, to float off of it. And so they would have wagons that would just take you out just deep enough so that you could get out and into the boat, and the boat was still afloat. So we're looking at a small party. The woman has a little hamper, maybe a picnic basket or something in her hands. There's the dog, there's a well-dressed man climbing in. I imagine one could frame an argument that that's Van de Velde himself heading out to observe the fleet. Don't quote me on that, but I'm crafting a storyline here. And then let's look back at that figurehead. Here it is looking towards us, and back to the mop. I mean, the mop is really a fascinating thing. I think about the mop because it's so prominent. It seems to be, lots of Dutch painting has little elements that I think Claire described as, in real life, everything is scattered around, so for the painting to be realistic, you have to include all of those little elements, because that's what breathes the authenticity into a painting. In this case, that's certainly true with the mop, but I think the mop is so prominent, it seems to be making a statement in that regard. So it's more than just a mop, in my view. And if that is the case, what could it do? It could be simply showing that the crew showed up. The crew was a little late in preparing the vessel for the day's voyage, and that this is a hurried situation. It could be emphasizing sort of a class distinction between those who were operating the vessel and those who were getting off of the wagon into the vessel. But there's also a few other possibilities as well. If you think about a mop, I'm sorry, let me just go to this painting first. This is, Claire didn't, she just showed an image of the second voyage back from the East Indies in 1599 by Heinrich Rome. What we're looking at here is an Ertveld copy of that painting, which is the same subject, but in it, Ertveld has included a lot more vessels, a lot more color, a lot more vibrancy. It's not quite of the same artistic merit, I think it's fair to say, but it's a very active painting, and it's much more Dutch in the respect that it includes all sorts of references to daily life, of that kind of prosaic activity, including all the way in the left, which just off to the end of the vessel there, an image of a man sort of hanging his backside off of the boat with his pants down. You can envision what's going on there. Exactly the same thing that we have Van de Velde doing there, but, and as humorous as it is, and now quintessentially Dutch as it might be, it actually is a statement of sorts about what the artist expects the viewer to take away from the painting. And so the mop is in some ways maybe the similar treatment. But then again, it might be of more symbolic reference as well, because a mop in 17th century Netherlands didn't have any special significance. If you stretch your imagination, so this isn't a mop anymore, but it's a broom. When you wanted to sell a boat in the 17th century Netherlands, you strapped a broom to your ship, to the mast of your ship. A vertical broom indicated that you were accepting offers on a boat. But then if you take it one step further, in 1652, November of 1652, so 9 months before this painting was created, Admiral Tromp in off the Kentish coast, the Battle of Dungeness, the Dutch decimated a British fleet in that area and cleared the English Channel of major English warships, and so the Dutch controlled the English Channel and all trade that went through it for several months at that point. And the rumor, the legend had it that Admiral Tromp strapped a broom to his vessel to indicate that he had swept the channel clean of his enemies. So 9 months later, when this painting might have been created, if that was when Van de Velde was on the coast, there could have been a very symbolic sort of proud reference to Dutch naval supremacy seen there in the mop. So just very quickly, environments where paintings like this would have been hung. I think the important thing to keep in mind is that they are beautiful paintings, but they were intended to foster conversation. You weren't just supposed to walk by and say, ah, but you were supposed to gather around them and discuss them in an intellectual fashion. These were points to bring up humanistic topics of conversation that were considered of importance to the Dutch. And in the upper right, we see a family, and the grouping is lots of marine paintings, it probably in a home. And then in the lower left, it looks more like a tavern. And then there were the very large paintings that appeared in public spaces, where the general public was welcome, and those paintings in general tend to promote political topics a little bit more clearly. Then there is, in closing, the topic of these little holes, which I don't have any greater insights than anyone else does, but I have my final speculation on, because these holes are so regular and they run along the edge, they're not as if one was just tacking the panel to a large frame. This is highly unusual, as Rhona mentioned. But so thinking about that what I've shown in the center is the interior of a ship's cabin. Is it possible that this panel was actually installed within the architecture of a building, or beyond that, even within the architecture of a ship's cabin, where we know many of Van de Velde's clients had private yachts and things. And so we have absolutely no information about what the interiors of 17th century Dutch private yachts looked like. There are very vague comments about luxury, but no specific descriptions, which leaves me wide open to speculate. But we can imagine about how the paneling would have been held in with borders, much like in the center I have a small image of the yacht Coronet, which granted is American in the 1880s. And there are panels with some decoration on them, not specific scenes. But down at the New York Yacht Club, the painting at the bottom is of a New York Yacht Club race from 1854, I think, and it was painted for and built into the main salon, the cabin of one of the prominent yachts of the New York Yacht Club. And I've been in touch with the curator down there. She said it's framed and backed and I can't see anything. And so we put this in the realm of future research opportunities, where we might be able to find out if that might have been mounted in a similar fashion. So, with that, I'm finished. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Rhona. I think I could probably, if you could both join me again for just a few minutes. I don't know what our time frame is, but we probably can answer a few questions if anyone has one. So please feel free. Yes, please.
Sorry, I missed the what on the panel? Sorry, I didn't hear you. No, there's no. Sorry, if I said that, I misspoke. There's no fabric. Basically there are two ground layers, right onto the wood. There's a calcium carbonate, but ground that's a kind of warm tone. And then on top of that, a lead white ground that has a real texture to it, which I'm intrigued by, because it really seems there's a conscious attempt to get some kind of texture, possibly to describe a paper. I don't know, but there's no fabric at all. A panel painting? Yes, that would be what I would call it, I think. Yes. You know, I feel like probably I was incredibly lucky to find a painting that was in remarkably good condition, and I think the key aspect of the treatment was it was not necessarily so complicated to remove the natural resin with organic solvents. It was, you just wanted to be gentle because of the material of the drawing. I think what people have come across before are paintings that have been perhaps over-cleaned in the past and revarnished, and then you get into a situation where you have things that actually are much more likely to be sensitive to your own solvents, and that can be really difficult. Or you have people who are cleaning paintings that are highly restored, and the lines disappear, but they were gone already. So for me, it was more just approaching it very gently, being conscious of what the materials were likely to be on the panel, there perhaps was some. Certainly, we didn't want to get into anything that had water involved in it, just in case the drawing, in fact, was still somewhat water sensitive. But other than that, a relatively simple set of combinations of solvents really did just dissolve and gently remove that veil of yellow varnish, and the drawing below was really beautifully preserved. So I think I was just very lucky, actually. Actually, I didn't. We talked about it, but it seems like everything I've read about these paintings and talking to colleagues who were very generous, actually, both at the Maritime Museum and at the Rijksmuseum, the conventional wisdom is that they were intended to be varnished, and that was part of what made them actually, as Claire described, and it wasn't what I did, you could wipe them down with a sponge because the varnish would protect the drawing. So there's a very thin layer of varnish back on the surface, because that seemed to be what the artist would have originally intended.
Oh, Dan has a question.
For you?
No, for you. Rhona, I'm just interested. You might be able to answer this.